Good evening. Welcome to NDTV Profit. I'm Vikram Oza, and tonight our spotlight is on Greenland. Greenland is that vast icy island. Many of us think of it as just a giant snow cap on the world map, but actually it swung into the headlines because of what the American president is saying about it. He's actively discussing ways to acquire Greenland. It's not the first time, but now those calls have become that much more severe. According to the White House, the use of American military forces is, in their words, always an option. To many, this is not diplomatic hedging. It is not bluster. It actually amounts to audacious geopolitics. Just weeks after the American operation in Venezuela, where American forces captured the country's president Nicolas Maduro, Washington's rhetoric now has shifted from oil and sanctions, trade sanctions. Now it's moving to territorial acquisition. Remember, Greenland is a semi-autonomous Danish territory. It is part of NATO's northern flank, and its people have made it clear that Greenland is not for sale. So the question is, why Greenland? Why so much focus on Greenland? Well, for Washington, it's about geology as much as it is about geopolitics. The island sits smack between North America and Europe. It is actually at the choke point where NATO watches and tracks Russian submarines. And as the Arctic ice melts, new sea routes are opening, and Russia and China are sniffing around for influence in that region, which makes Greenland a very new, a very hot ticket in the great power game playing out there. And beneath all that ice lie vast deposits of rare earths and critical minerals, the elements that power electric vehicles and semiconductors, batteries, defense technology, and tomorrow's supply chains, as it were. So the new oil, a lot of it in the vast Greenland, the icy layers of Greenland. So the Americans, they publicly downplayed the resource angle. But analysts are saying that it is a co-driver alongside the security angle, especially in a world trying to reduce reliance on China's grip on critical minerals. Because make no mistake, if Washington openly debates military options to acquire a sovereign piece of land, the implications are massive. Not just for NATO, not just for Arctic security, but for how nations, both great nations and rising nations, how they defend interests, how resources and reputations are going to be formed in the decades to come. Which is why we're asking tonight, has the post-World War II rules-based order, the one that forbids powerful nations from swiping small territories, has that begun to crumble? And how does this ripple out from Greenland to Taiwan and China, or from Russia's moves in Ukraine? This is the big question on NDTV Profit. After Venezuela, Trump's Greenland gambit. Is the US normalizing territorial ambition? Let's debate this with our panel. And joining us on the panel tonight, we have the former Indian ambassador, Deepak Bhojwani, is with us. Also, global macro strategist Arnab Das is joining us from London. And Vivek Mishra is with us. He's Deputy Director of Strategic Studies Program at ORF, Observer Research Foundation. Great to have you. And from Singapore, David Roche is also with us. He's strategist at Quantum Strategy. But let me begin by asking you, Ambassador Bhojwani, from your perspective, is this American kind of push that we are seeing? Many are touting it as the Monroe Doctrine, something that comes from the 19th century, but it's about the Americans taking control even as China is flexing muscle, Iran is. Is this an American reaction to that? How do you read it?
There's a history, to this, because it's not as if this is the first time the US has tried to acquire Greenland. You're right in saying that Greenland, as a former colony of Denmark, is a self-governing territory. It's an autonomous territory. The Danes voluntarily, in 2009, signed an agreement allowing Greenland to decide its own future. And the Greenlanders have been doing so. They held elections last year, and they're quite categorical in saying that they don't want to be part of America or anywhere else. They want to be independent. However, there is a history. Since the 19th century, the US has been making noises. Presidents, and even someone like Nelson Rockefeller, I understand, had offered to buy Greenland and make it a part of the United States. They have not succeeded. However, in 1951, actually during the Second World War, the Americans were allowed into Greenland to defend it against the Nazis and so on. And in 1951, a formal treaty was signed between the US and Denmark, which is then the colonial power for Greenland, saying that the US has the right to establish bases in Greenland. And in the northwest of that territory, they have actually one base, which was earlier a military base, but now is called a space base. There's a history to that also, because today space tracking, orbiting satellites, etc., is important too. So what's happened is that the U.S. has this base. It has about 150 soldiers or military people there. I understand it's been sending, people have gone there. The government representatives, they even have a special envoy, and Donald Trump has, well, his foreign minister has hinted that they could even offer to buy Greenland. And as we've seen, and as you've said, President Trump has threatened that if he can't get it by hook, he'll get it by crook, by military means. But that's where it stands right now, and the Danes have become very upset. The Prime Minister of Denmark has issued a very strong statement, there's nothing doing, that this could break up NATO, of which both countries are members, and also threaten the transatlantic alliance. And very recently, I think a couple of days ago, about 5 or 6 heads of European states issued a statement saying that we need to, it was a rather bland statement considering the crisis that has developed, saying that this should be negotiated or something to that effect. I'm not sure. However, the matter has become pretty hot, as I understand.
It is. It's more than hot right now. Arnab Das, do weigh in. While we have the historical context from the ambassador, you tell us from what you're understanding with the operation in Venezuela, which turns out it is so much about oil. Is this entire move towards Greenland as well less about ideology and more about hard economics? Energy, minerals, supply chains, at a time when the great powers are scrambling for strategic assets to make the semiconductors and the defense technology of tomorrow. Is this much more about that than anything else?
Look, I think, the way it seems to me that President Trump himself operates and by extension, the administration and now the U.S. government operates is that it bundles up a whole bunch of issues together. So I think it's actually quite hard to disaggregate and disentangle the different motivations here. So I think you're absolutely right. Resources, whether it's oil or critical minerals and rare earths, are a big part of the story here. I think in the case of Venezuela, the drug trafficking is an important part of the story, as well as kind of the signal that countries in Latin America and indeed other parts of the world that do not have their own domestic act together are creating a source of immigration, which the president in the U.S. has characterized as an invasion of immigrants. In this case, across the southern border, or with boats across the now what's called the Gulf of America, at least according to President Trump, what has been long the Gulf of Mexico, right? So I think there are a host of different issues at work here, and I think, as the ambassador has said, the U.S. has been trying to acquire Greenland in one way or another since 1867. I think, what's happening here is that they are quite concerned about incursions into the U.S. Territorial waters and near abroad from the Arctic by both Russia and China. And so I think we should take President Trump very seriously about the acquisition of Greenland. I think between Trump and Rubio, there's a kind of good cop, bad cop thing going on with the president willing to signal the use of military force, and the Secretary of State willing to signal this kind of somewhat more friendly acquisition by purchase, right?
Yes.
And I think it's important to say here that the U.S. Itself grew through annexation and acquisition in the westward expansion, in its early history, right? And became a continental country and economy, and I would say even a great power and ultimately a superpower,
yes,
through annexation and purchases of territory from European powers in decline, right?
Yes.
Or at least under pressure.
Yes.
So I think that's what's going on here.
So you think that this is an extension of that strategy, but the dynamics of the world have changed to a large extent. We keep talking about the world order and how the big shifts are taking place. How much of that comes from a security perspective? Vivek Mishra, how critical is Greenland, according to you, for American defense right now? Because yes, we are talking about a whole load of minerals and the kind of resources that you require for the future, but talk to us about the security perspective, the missile early warning systems, the Arctic surveillance, the deterrents that need to be placed against Russia and China. Is that the real driving force over here? Whether America goes through with acquisition or takes on a more aggressive route, which is not a purchase, how do you think the security angle is going to come into play?
Oh, it's absolutely at the heart of what America is trying to, how America is trying to reframe its security policy. If you see the national security strategies of successive presidents culminating in the Trump presidency, the Arctic has occupied a substantive place in the strategy document. So I think it's pretty important. But what's happening now is that the High North is, of course, America's realization that they are behind the curve when compared to China and Russia. Count the icebreakers, count the capacity in that region. Russia is ahead, and obviously Russia and China are working together on many issues. And therefore, you also have Trump administration in the past and before the national security strategy also bringing out something called the executive order for reviving the naval industry and the maritime vision of America. And I think that's more focused on the Arctic than on the Indo-Pacific. Because clearly the Indo-Pacific has fallen down the rung in terms of priority for the Trump presidency. So I think the High North, the route that is opening up, America's focus on maritime rejuvenation is, of course, geared to the Arctic region. Now, from the security perspective and from the energy perspective, I think it's going to be challenging for the United States, really, because the shipping routes to get the minerals. First is the mining and the processing. I think that's difficult in Greenland, as far as I'm informed. Plus, shipping them to any continent is going to be one of the most challenging things because there are only counted number of days that the shipping lanes can actually be functional, given the amount of ice present. So I think it's going to be logistically challenging for America to even bring that. Now, flying it out from there could be one option, but we'll see how that pans out. But from the security angle, I think both China and Russia, how that's going to play out in terms of the sphere of influence strategy that is playing out right now is going to be my main sort of question in to put forward. Yes. In terms of America trying to recenter on Western Hemisphere and allowing tacitly China and Russia to do something in their own sphere. How that all comes together in the Arctic is something that remains to be seen.
It remains to be seen, but isn't this dangerous territory? David Roche, when President Trump is saying we have to have Greenland, do you think it's more than strategic signaling over here? Or do you think this is now getting normalized? Territorial claims by major powers, and of course this is not a territorial claim as such, but China is making one on Taiwan. And perhaps in a sense, looking at the historical background of how the Americans have sought Greenland, both for strategic purposes, for security purposes, and the resources that it brings to the table. How important is this, according to you, the normalization right now that we're seeing of territorial claims by major powers like America here in this case?
I think it's very important. Let me put it to you this way. We had a nice, cozy system of legal behavior by great powers who guaranteed the rights of smaller powers and obeyed international law, and it's gone. And instead of that, we have a new system, which is invented by Trump, which he says goes back to the Monroe document idea, but it actually doesn't, because the Monroe document was intended to stop powers grabbing former Spanish colonies which were claiming their own independence. It has nothing to do with what we're living through. What this is Trump and his administration, including Rubio, who may have a more gentle mouth, but certainly not a more reasonable brain. Their aim is to exert total control over their sphere of influence, which is the North Pole heading south right down to the end of Chile. That's what they want to control. Whatever happens there, politically in smaller nations and so on, has to be in line with their desires. Now, that's what Venezuela is about. It's what Colombia is going to be about. It's what the impending fall of Cuba is going to be about. But it is not only about that sphere of influence. Trump also wants to exert dominance over global oil supplies, energy supplies, which would bring OPEC under his control and make Putin, which would, of course, have another sphere of influence, in which we lucky Europeans would probably be a part. It would make him very much a second-rank emperor within his sphere of influence. And then you have China. Okay, now what is the meaning for China and for Russia? Well, the first thing is if people like Trump, wannabe dictators like Trump, can go around the place just grabbing countries which are a part of an alliance that they are, under which they promise to defend those countries, if you can grab democracies for no apparent reason, then essentially, how do you turn around to dictators and say, well, you should not be trying to invade and conquer Ukraine. You should not have ambitions to take over Taiwan because, this is not the right thing to do. But you can't say that anymore because the United States is doing exactly the same thing for exactly the same reasons as nations did this back in the 19th century. They want the resources, they want the power, and they want the control. It's all three things.
So, Ambassador Bhojwani, this is an important piece. Now, NATO is a very strong alliance. To that extent, this kind of rhetoric, since Greenland is part of Denmark and Denmark is part of NATO, this can be very damaging to the NATO, as it were. How damaging and what does it actually mean for countries who've gotten together to secure themselves against any attack outside of that alliance?
I think in the first place, we must recognize that NATO has been crumbling ever since Trump's first term. Late in his first term, we were told by John Bolton, who was, I think, still his national security advisor, that Trump was threatening to quit NATO. And fortunately, says John Bolton, he didn't manage to do it before his presidency ended. He was hoping for a second term, might have left NATO. And we've seen over the past few years, especially over the issue of Ukraine, how Trump has treated NATO, the European NATO that I refer to. And the poor Europeans, I feel, but you can hardly pity them because they've been behaving pretty hypocritically, in my opinion. But the fact of the matter is that Trump is telling NATO, accept what I do and bend the knee if I ask you to. Otherwise, you're going to lose much more than what I will. I mean, he has nothing to lose anyway. And the poor Europeans, at least the ones in East Europe, former Eastern Europe, and the ones a little bit further away, like Germany and so on and so forth, are pretty petrified because they see Russia as an existential threat, although Russia has made no claims to invade Europe. Now, that being the case, what does that leave NATO with? It leaves NATO with the possibility of withdrawal or at least diminution. I think that's already started, of US troops from NATO countries. And it leaves a US that is saying that, look, we will dominate the Western Hemisphere, like it or not. Now, after that, whether Trump has greater plans for global domination, we don't know. But as to come back to the issue of security, what's happening is that we all know that the northern route over Russia around the Arctic is opening up. Russia has been definitely more present, its navy, etc. Even the Chinese have ambitions there. And Donald Trump has, perhaps somewhat correctly for once, stated that it's a national security threat. Naturally, it's a national security threat, but it's a threat that he is creating and to which the Russians may well react. Because if push comes to shove, you can't blame the Russians for telling the Americans where they should get off.
Right.
The Europeans do that.
Because even Russia has talked about exactly that as a reason to get into Ukraine. Isn't that right?
Absolutely. Absolutely. The Russians have legitimate security reasons to fear from Europe and, of course, further afield from the United States, although Putin and Trump have managed to establish a modus vivendi, at least on the surface.
Correct.
So the idea here is that if Russia develops its capacities beyond a point.
Yes.
You see, in my opinion, if I may have just half a minute, in my opinion, what Trump and even the US, forget about Trump, it's not just Trump, it's the US, because Trump has not built up this predominant military capacity overnight or during his 2 terms. It has been built up steadily over decades by a US that has got many more bases than any other country or all the other countries put together all
Yes.
over the world.
Yes.
So the US dominates militarily and it wants to keep doing so. Simple.
Vivek Mishra, as we try and understand how the world order is changing, what does this moment mean for India? Our Arctic interests, our possibilities of navigation there, critical mineral security, and these kind of rights across the Indo-Pacific, how much of a bearing do these developments have for us?
I mean, with the coming of critical minerals, I think India, whatever happens in the globe and how the developments shape the supply chain of critical minerals will greatly impact India. That's for one. Now, as for Arctic, I think India's interests have increased over the past decade, I think considerably, but the amount of presence and footprints that we have still remains limited. So I think directly, if the strategic stability of Arctic suddenly goes down, I don't think it will directly impact India in the manner that it will impact other great powers. So I think we are a little buffered from that. But potentially in terms of how it impacts supply chains, how it impacts other countries and their capacity to link with the world, certainly changes. And at a point in the Biden administration, just 2 or 3, 3 years back, we were talking about linking the transatlantic interest with the Indo-Pacific. Now that's all up in the air, and suddenly, we've become more distant than we ever were. So I think India right now is at a cusp where we have to reframe some of our security thinking, some of our certainly our relations with great power in a new way, perhaps.
And David, according to you, are we seeing a temporary Trump-era disruption because we've not even completed 1 year of the second term of President Trump in the US? Or do you think this is going to be the beginning of a permanent shift towards this kind of territorial ambition in global geopolitics?
I think the shift is permanent. And the reason why I think the shift is permanent is that Trump is, in fact, the symptom of America's problems. But he is not the cause. The American people elected Trump, and he got them the majority of the popular vote. So the polarization of American society has produced this kind of a fertile soil of isolationism, exercise of power, and the domination of America in world politics so that they can live in peace at home and not be bothered by honoring treaties or being nice to their allies. So the reason I think this is a permanent shift is because that is a shift which will not go away. When Donald Trump goes, you may get worse, or you may get a movement, a quite dramatic movement towards dictatorship. So I would say that don't hold your breath for this to end. We are going to be living with the Americans' desire to exert certainly hemispherical dominance and possibly even worse forms of power, military power enforced global dominance. But we are not going to go back to the nice days of running the global economy on the basis of globalization, the rule of law, and free trade. That is gone.
That's a rather gloomy prediction, but what is clear from this discussion is that Greenland is clearly not just about ice and territory or even one president's audacity. That's what my big takeaway is from what David is saying. It's about a world where strategic geography and critical minerals and security anxieties, all of them are once again colliding with long-held global norms. Whether this is going to be a short-term disruption or the start of a deeper shift towards territorial power politics, now that is a picture that is unfolding, but the risks for alliances like NATO, for stability, and for several countries, including India, are very real. I want to thank my panelists for joining us, Deepak Bhojwani, Arnab Das, Vivek Mishra, David Roche. Thank you very much for joining us with your insights. We'll carry on these discussions, but this is a turning point, as it were, when it comes to geopolitics and the kind of diplomacy that has been practiced, and now this kind of aggression that we are seeing from a superpower is going to be an interesting space to watch of the kind of form it takes in the future. Thanks very much for joining us tonight. And with that, we'll wrap it up on this edition of The Big Question. I'm Vikram Oza from me and the team. Thank you indeed for joining us. Have a great evening ahead.